The rumble of the Harley echoed down the quiet road as the sun dipped low behind the hills, painting the sky with streaks of orange and gold. The sound wasn't harsh or wild. It was steady, deep, and smooth, like the heartbeat of a giant engine that had seen miles of open highway. Neighbors turned their heads as the man rode slowly past, his leather jacket catching the glow of the fading light. He wasn't racing or showing off. He was simply arriving home after a long day, the weight of the world carried calmly on his shoulders. The Harley gleamed black and chrome, polished to shine despite the dust of the road, its pipes growling softly as he rolled into his driveway. Children on bicycles stopped at the corner, their eyes wide with admiration. One of them whispered, "That's the coolest bike I've ever seen." Their parents, standing near their porches, gave small nods of respect. Even those who never cared for motorcycles could not deny there was something commanding about the way the man moved, about the way he parked the Harley in front of his cabin as if it belonged there as much as the trees and the land itself. He shut off the engine, and the silence that followed was heavy but not empty. It was the kind of silence that made people watch a little longer than they should, that made whispers float in the air. Across the street, however, stood a different pair of eyes. HOA Karen's son, a young man spoiled by years of entitlement, leaned against their porch railing. His eyes were not wide with respect like the children's, nor filled with quiet admiration like the neighbors'. No, his gaze was hungry, greedy, sharp. He stared at the Harley as if it were not another man's possession but already his own, as if the world owed him anything he desired. His lips curled into a smirk as he muttered under his breath, "That bike should be mine." Inside their house, the curtains shifted, and Karen herself peeked out, her sharp eyes narrowing as she saw the motorcycle gleaming in the driveway. Her mouth twisted with disapproval, and she pulled the curtain aside, stepping onto her porch. "That thing isn't even allowed here," she said loud enough for the neighbors to hear. "No motorcycles in this community. The rules are clear." But the man didn't react. He stood by his bike, calmly removing his gloves and placing them on the seat. He glanced at her once, a brief, steady look, then turned and walked toward his door without a word. His silence was heavier than any argument. It unsettled her. Karen huffed, folding her arms, then turned back into her house, muttering about rules and violations. Her son stayed behind, though, his eyes locked on the Harley until the last trace of sunlight disappeared. That night, their home was not filled with peace but with whispers of greed and arrogance. Karen sat at her kitchen table, sipping her wine, her voice sharp as she spoke to her son. "That motorcycle has no place in this neighborhood. The HOA rules state clearly, no loud vehicles, no motorcycles, no exceptions. He's breaking the law, and I will not allow it." Her son leaned forward, his eyes glinting with entitlement. "You don't get it, Mom. That's not just some motorcycle. That's a Harley. Do you know what one of those costs? Do you know what it means to own one? It screams power. It screams freedom. And it should be mine." Karen frowned. "Yours? Don't be ridiculous. You don't just take things because you want them." He smirked, his voice low and confident. "Why not? We run this neighborhood. You're the one with the power. Everyone listens to you. You find people for their mailboxes, for their grass, even for leaving their trash cans out too long. And they all obeyed. You can make him hand over the bike. Or at least get rid of it." Karen swirled her wine glass, considering his words. "I can call the board, bring it up at the next meeting. We can fine him heavily for breaking the rules." But her son shook his head, impatient. "Fines? Meetings? That takes too long. I want that Harley, Mom. That man doesn't even deserve it. He's too quiet, too plain. He doesn't show it off. He doesn't even look like he rides for fun. He just parks it there, like it's nothing. He doesn't value it the way I would." His eyes narrowed, his voice sharpening. "That bike is mine, and I'm going to get it." Karen laughed, a sharp, unpleasant sound. "You think you can just take it? That man won't give it up so easily." But her son leaned closer, his tone dripping with arrogance. "Then we'll make him." For a long moment, The house was filled only with the sound of the ticking clock on the wall. Karen's face hardened, her pride fueling her son's greed. She set down her glass firmly, her lips curling into a thin smile. Fine. If he wants to defy the rules, then he'll learn the hard way. We'll call the cops. We'll make him look like a criminal. Once they're involved, he'll have no choice but to obey. Her son grinned, satisfied, his eyes already picturing himself straddling the Harley, the engine roaring under his control. Upstairs, the man's cabin stood quiet, the Harley gleaming faintly under the porch light. He had seen greed in men's eyes before. He had heard arrogance in voices that thought they held power. But he had also learned long ago that silence was stronger than shouting, and patience was sharper than anger. He sat by his window, the glow of the Harley reflecting in the glass, his face calm, his thoughts unreadable. Across the street, the boy stared out his own window, his greedy eyes locked on the bike, whispering to himself, "It's mine. It's going to be mine." And in that quiet night, while the crickets sang and the stars stretched across the dark sky, suspense hung heavy in the air. The neighbors didn't know it yet, but a storm was coming. A storm born not of noise or fists, but of arrogance clashing with quiet strength. And when it broke, someone was going to regret ever thinking they could claim what was never theirs. The morning air was cool and still, the sun barely climbing above the horizon, casting a pale gold over the quiet street. Birds sang in the trees, and neighbors walked lazily with their coffee mugs, enjoying the start of another day. The calm, however, didn't last long. From across the street, Karen's son stormed out of his house, his footsteps heavy, his chest puffed up like a soldier marching into battle. His eyes were fixed on one thing, the Harley gleaming in the driveway. It sat there like a black jewel, the chrome shining even in the weak sunlight, a machine that spoke of freedom and strength without a single word. The boy's lips curled into a grin as he approached, loud enough so everyone could hear. "That bike doesn't belong here. HOA rules don't allow motorcycles. And if it doesn't belong here, it belongs to me." His voice cut through the calm of the morning, and instantly, heads turned. Curtains shifted, doors cracked open, neighbors stepped onto porches, drawn by the arrogance in his tone. The man was standing near his porch, sipping his morning coffee, his posture relaxed as if the world's noise could not disturb him. His eyes lifted slowly toward the boy, meeting his greedy stare without flinching, but he said nothing. The silence only seemed to fuel the boy's ego. "You think you can just park this Harley here like it's yours?" The boy shouted, walking right up to the driveway, his shoes crunching against the gravel. "This neighborhood has rules, and you're breaking them. No motorcycles, no loud engines, no trash cluttering up the street. And that bike," he jabbed a finger at it, his face tightening with entitlement, "isn't just a violation. It's mine now. I'm taking it." The neighbors gasped at the audacity. A few whispered to each other in disbelief. "He can't be serious," one said under her breath. "That's theft." Another shook his head, frowning. Karen's filled that boy's head with nonsense. "He thinks rules mean ownership." Karen stepped out of her house at that moment, her arms crossed tightly, her expression smug as she stood behind her son. "He's right," she declared loudly, her voice dripping with false authority. This community was built on respect and order. Motorcycles were banned for a reason. They disturb the peace, they bring trouble, and they lower property values. If you want to live here, you follow the rules. If you don't, then you leave, and leave that bike behind. Her son smirked even wider, emboldened by her presence. "You heard her. Hand over the keys, or you'll regret it." The man took another slow sip of his coffee, then set the cup down on the porch railing. He looked at them calmly, his eyes steady and unreadable. The crowd of neighbors held their breath, waiting for an explosion, a furious outburst, a fight to erupt right there on the driveway. But no such thing came. He simply stood there, his silence heavier than any words. Karen's smugness faltered for a second, but her son quickly stepped closer, almost close enough to touch the Harley. He bent down, his hand reaching as if to test the handlebar. "I'll just take it myself then," he sneered. Gasps erupted from the watching neighbors, and someone shouted, Don't you dare. But the boy only laughed. What's he going to do? He's just one man. My mom runs this place. We make the rules. The man's calm stare didn't waver, and that made the boy uneasy for a flicker of a second. His hand hovered near the Harley but didn't grip it. He could feel the weight of the man's gaze, not angry, not loud, but steady like stone, like a force stronger than any threat. Karen quickly covered her son's hesitation with more words. If you won't give up the bike, we'll fine you, she snapped. We'll bury you under penalties until you have no choice. And if that doesn't work, she pulled out her phone and waved it in the air. We'll call the cops. Let's see how long you stand proud when they drag you out for breaking the law. The neighbors murmured in disbelief, some shaking their heads, others too afraid to speak against her. They had seen Karen weaponize rules before, twisting them to her advantage, using her position in the HOA to crush anyone who dared oppose her. But this was different. This wasn't about a mailbox or a lawn or a trash can. This was about a man's property, a Harley Davidson that gleamed with pride and history. Everyone could feel it. This confrontation wasn't going to end like the others. The boy leaned against the bike now, his smirk returning. Sooner or later, it's going to be mine. Mom's right. You can't stop us. We control this neighborhood. You? You're just another name on a list of people who thought they could resist. And every single one of them learned the same lesson. You don't win against us. The man finally moved, stepping slowly down from the porch, his boots crunching the gravel with each measured step. The crowd hushed instantly, eyes wide as they watched him approach. He didn't hurry, didn't raise his voice, didn't even let his expression change. He simply walked until he stood between the boy and the Harley, his presence like a wall of quiet power. The boy tried to keep his smirk, but his throat tightened when he realized he had to tilt his head slightly to look up at the man's face. The silence stretched painfully long, broken only by the rustle of leaves in the breeze. And then the man did something none of them expected. He smiled, not a wide grin, not a mocking sneer, but a small, calm, steady smile. He said only one word, his voice low but carrying enough strength for everyone to hear. No, that single word dropped like a stone into still water, sending ripples through the crowd. The boy's smirk faltered, his arrogance shaken by the weight of that refusal. Karen's face turned red with fury. You'll regret this, she snapped, raising her phone. I'll call the police right now. They'll come here, and you'll be the one begging us for mercy. But the man only turned his gaze on her, the same calm stare that had silenced her son. He said nothing more, but that silence was enough to make her hesitate for just a moment before she angrily punched numbers into her phone. The neighbors looked at each other, whispers running through the crowd. Something was different about this man. He wasn't afraid, he wasn't bending, and he wasn't losing his cool. And that calmness, unnatural, unsettling, made everyone wonder the same thing. What did he know that they didn't? Suspense thickened in the air like a storm about to break. The boy stepped back, suddenly less sure of himself, while Karen's shrill voice carried as she demanded police come immediately. And through it all, the Harley sat gleaming, untouchable, as if it too belonged only to the man who refused to be broken. Karen's voice cut through the still morning like a knife, shrill and sharp as she pressed the phone to her ear. Her son stood beside her with a smug smirk, while the neighbors gathered closer, pretending to water their lawns or sweep their porches, though all eyes were fixed on the drama unfolding. The man remained still, his calm presence by the Harley making the entire scene feel strange, as if he knew exactly how it would end. Yes, this is an emergency. Karen shouted into the phone, pacing back and forth across her lawn so everyone could hear her words. There's a dangerous man in our neighborhood. He's threatening us with an illegal motorcycle, making trouble, and refusing to follow community rules. I feel unsafe. My son feels unsafe. We need officers here immediately. Her words were dripping with false panic, each sentence louder than the last. She knew the script well. She had done this before to neighbors who dared stand against her authority. If you screamed loudly enough, if you painted yourself as the victim, someone would believe you. Her son crossed his arms, nodding along, glancing proudly at the crowd. He leaned toward one of the neighbors and sneered, See? He's finished. Once the cops show up, they'll drag him off, and that Harley will be mine. But the neighbor only looked away, unwilling to agree. Everyone could see the difference. Karen's noise was desperate, full of fake emotion, while the man's silence was steady, almost unshakable. Karen shouted into the phone again. Yes, he's still here. He's glaring at us, intimidating us with that motorcycle. He refuses to hand it over. It's a violation of HOA law and he could be violent. Please hurry. We need help. Her son laughed, enjoying the attention. This is how you deal with people who think they're above the rules, he boasted loudly, making sure the man could hear. We call the law. We have control here. He'll learn his place. Still, the man didn't flinch. He leaned casually against his porch railing, arms folded, his face calm and unreadable. The Harley gleamed by his side, silent yet commanding, like a soldier at rest but ready for war. The quiet confidence unsettled more than one neighbor watching, and whispers spread. Why isn't he afraid? One woman whispered to her husband. Most people would panic when the cops are called. Her husband shook his head. Because he knows something. You can see it in his eyes. He's not just calm, he's waiting. Karen ended the call with a dramatic sigh, turning back to the man with a victorious smirk. The police are on their way, she announced loudly, her voice dripping with triumph. You've made a huge mistake. In a few minutes, you'll be in the back of a squad car, and that motorcycle will be impounded. Maybe then you'll finally learn to respect the rules. Her son clapped slowly, mocking applause as he circled closer to the Harley again. Enjoy your last few minutes with it, he sneered. Because soon it'll be mine. You'll be out of here, and I'll be riding this beast down the street. His hand hovered again near the handlebar, almost daring to touch it, but something in the man's steady gaze stopped him. He pulled his hand back quickly, trying to hide the flicker of hesitation. The man finally moved, only slightly, reaching for his coffee mug that still sat on the porch railing. He lifted it, took a slow sip, and set it back down, never breaking eye contact with Karen and her son. His silence was louder than their shouting. It was the silence of someone who wasn't threatened, someone who knew the weight of the law better than those pretending to wield it. Karen tried to ignore the unease that crept into her chest. She barked louder to cover it. This is what happens when people think they can break the law in my neighborhood. No one is above the HOA. No one. Her son laughed, pointing at the man. Look at him. He's not even defending himself. He knows he's guilty. But the neighbors weren't so convinced. A few shook their heads, some crossed their arms, and others whispered among themselves. They'd seen Karen twist rules before, but this time it felt different. This wasn't about grass too long or mailboxes painted the wrong color. This was about a man's property, his life, and his rights. And that man didn't look guilty. He looked like he was simply waiting for the truth to reveal itself. A siren wailed faintly in the distance, growing louder with each passing second. The crowd shifted, excitement and nerves mixing together. Karen's face lit up with smug confidence as she straightened her shoulders, ready to put on the performance of a lifetime. Her son puffed out his chest, already imagining the Harley's keys in his pocket. But the man? He remained perfectly still, his eyes steady, his face calm. He didn't look like a man about to be arrested. He looked like someone who had seen this all before, someone who already knew how it would end. The sirens drew closer, the red and blue lights flashing faintly on the horizon. Suspense gripped the entire neighborhood. Everyone leaned forward, waiting to see how the quiet man with the Harley would handle the storm that Karen had unleashed. The sound of sirens grew louder until flashing red and blue lights danced across the quiet neighborhood street. Engines hummed low as two squad cars pulled up in front of the man's cabin. Doors opened, and uniformed officers stepped out, their presence commanding immediate silence from the watching crowd. Neighbors froze where they stood, clutching their coffee mugs, some whispering nervously. Karen's face lit up with triumph. She straightened her posture, fixing her blouse, her voice suddenly trembling with exaggerated emotion as she rushed forward to meet the officers. "Thank goodness you're here," she cried, her hands waving toward the man's driveway. That man has been threatening us. He brought an illegal motorcycle into this neighborhood. He refused to obey HOA rules, and he glared at us with intimidation. My son and I feel unsafe. You need to take action before he gets violent." The officers exchanged quick glances, their faces neutral. They didn't rush. They didn't reach for weapons. They simply listened, their eyes flicking from Karen's frantic gestures to the quiet man standing calmly on his porch. Karen's son stepped forward, his chest puffed with arrogance. "He's breaking the law," the boy added loudly, his voice dripping with entitlement. "You should confiscate that Harley. He doesn't deserve it. He's a danger to the community. It should be mine." A ripple of disbelief spread through the neighbors. Some covered their mouths, shocked at the boldness of the demand. One muttered under his breath, "He just told the cops he wants to steal the bike." But Karen ignored the murmurs, doubling down on her performance. She clutched her chest as if the weight of the world had fallen on her shoulders. "Please, officers, you must do something," she begged. "This is our home, our sanctuary, and he's destroying it. He's dangerous. Look at that machine. It doesn't belong here. It's against the rules, and he refuses to leave." The officers finally turned their attention to the man. He hadn't moved since they arrived. He stood near the Harley, calm and steady, his hands resting casually at his sides, his eyes fixed firmly on the officers. There was no panic, no anger, no defense. Just silence. One of the officers stepped forward, his voice steady but respectful. "Sir, can we talk for a moment?" The man nodded once, then slowly reached into his jacket pocket. Karen gasped theatrically, her voice shrill. "See? He's reaching. I told you he was dangerous." The officers didn't flinch. They watched calmly as the man pulled out a small leather wallet and flipped it open. He handed it to the officer in front. The officer's eyes scanned the card inside. For a moment, his face shifted from professional neutrality to sudden recognition. He looked up, his expression sharper now, his tone respectful. "Understood, sir." Karen blinked, her smugness faltering. What is it? What did he show you?" "Some kind of fake ID," she demanded, her voice cracking. The officer ignored her and handed the wallet back to the man, giving him a small nod of acknowledgement. The other officer, curious, asked quietly, "Do you want us to handle this?" The man shook his head once, his expression still calm. "No. Let her finish." That simple statement, delivered with quiet authority, sent a chill through the crowd. Karen, however, thought she still had control. She jabbed her finger toward the Harley again. "Why are you just standing there? Arrest him. He's breaking rules, and you're letting him stand there mocking me." Her son chimed in eagerly. "Confiscate the bike. Give me the keys. That's the only way this ends." The officers finally turned on Karen, their patience thinning. We'll ask the questions here. Please lower your voice." Karen's face twisted in outrage. "Lower my voice? You should be thanking me for keeping this neighborhood safe. He's the criminal. He's the danger. And if you don't act, then I'll take this higher. I'll call your supervisors." Her son stepped closer to the Harley, emboldened by his mother's rant, his hand brushing against the handlebar. "It's mine anyway," he sneered, gripping the chrome. But before his fingers could wrap around it, the man took a single step forward. He didn't shout, he didn't raise a hand, but the boy froze in place as though the weight of that movement was enough to stop him cold. The calm stare from the man's eyes sent a silent message. "Don't." The boy's smirk faltered, his confidence draining as he quickly pulled his hand back, pretending he was only pointing. The neighbors held their breath, the tension so thick it felt like the air itself had stopped moving. The officers exchanged looks, their expressions hardening. One of them said firmly, "What exactly do you expect us to do here? You called us claiming you felt unsafe, but from where we're standing, it doesn't look like this man has done anything." Karen's face reddened, her voice screeching higher. "He's breaking HOA rules. That's a crime. You need to remove him now." The officer's patience snapped. HOA rules are not criminal law. They're civil matters. And calling us for this, He gestured toward the quiet man and the untouched Harley, is a misuse of emergency services. Gasps spread through the crowd. Karen's smug mask cracked, her son's arrogant posture faltered, and whispers rushed like wildfire through the neighbors. She called 911, for HOA rules, one woman muttered. She lied to the police, another added. Karen stammered, her voice shaking with desperation now. No, you don't understand. He's dangerous. He's just standing there like he owns the place. The man finally spoke, his voice calm but sharp enough to cut through the chaos. I do own my place. And I know the law better than anyone here. His words weren't loud, but the weight behind them silenced every whisper, every laugh, every murmur. Karen's face turned pale. Her son stared at the ground, no longer smirking. And for the first time, the neighbors realized the truth. This wasn't just a man with a Harley. This was someone who carried power, real power, the kind that Karen and her son had never truly understood. The officers gave him another respectful nod. We'll file a report about the misuse of emergency services. Beyond that, it's in your hands, sir. With that, they turned away, leaving Karen trembling, her face burning with humiliation as the red and blue lights faded from the street. And yet, the man still didn't raise his voice. He simply stood there, his silence heavier than ever, while Karen's so-called victory crumbled around her. The street was silent after the squad cars drove away, but the silence was not peace. It was heavy, buzzing with whispers and tension. Neighbors lingered at their porches, pretending to water plants or sweep steps, but really they wanted to see what would happen next. Karen stood frozen in the middle of her lawn, her phone clutched tightly in her hand, her face pale with disbelief. Her son shuffled behind her, his arrogance cracked, his eyes darting nervously from the Harley to the man who still stood calmly on his porch. The Harley gleamed as if nothing had happened, its chrome reflecting the morning sun, the machine standing as steady and proud as its owner. The man hadn't moved, hadn't raised his voice, hadn't lost his temper once. He finally broke the silence, his voice low but carrying enough weight for every neighbor to hear. Do you know why they didn't take me away? He asked calmly, his eyes on Karen. Karen blinked, caught off guard by the sudden question. Her mouth opened and closed, but no words came. Her son tried to cover the moment with a scoff. Because they're lazy? Because they didn't want to deal with it? Doesn't matter. You broke the rules, and we'll still make you pay fines. But his voice trembled slightly, betraying his fear. The man took a slow step forward, the gravel crunching under his boots. His presence was heavy, commanding, though he didn't need to raise his tone. No, he said simply. They didn't take me away because they know who I am. They know what I do. And they know I don't answer to you. The crowd of neighbors leaned forward, whispers spreading quickly. Who is he? One woman whispered. Why would the cops respect him like that? An older man muttered. I've never seen officers turn so quickly. Karen laughed nervously, her voice high-pitched and forced. You're bluffing. You're just some nobody who bought a motorcycle to look tough. You think silence makes you powerful? No. Power is in the rules. Power is in the HOA. And we decide what happens here. The man's eyes didn't leave hers. He reached into his jacket again, and this time he pulled out not just the small leather wallet but also a folded folder, thick with papers. He walked slowly down his porch steps and stopped in the middle of the driveway, his movement steady, his face unreadable. He opened the folder and held it up for the neighbors closest to see. This, he said, his voice calm but sharp, is my clearance. I am not just a man with a Harley. I am the lead investigator who briefs the state attorney. The same state attorney who has authority over misuse of law enforcement, false reports, harassment, and fraud. The police didn't question me because they've stood in my briefings. They know I work above their level, and they know exactly who they'd be crossing if they sided with lies. Gasps ran through the crowd like a wave. Neighbors covered their mouths, wide-eyed, while others exchanged shocked looks. Karen's smug smile evaporated instantly, her face turning ghostly pale. Her son stepped back as if the words themselves had struck him. The man lowered the folder slowly, his eyes locked on Karen. So let's be clear. You lied to the police. You wasted emergency resources. You filed a false report. That alone could cost you thousands in fines and possibly charges. And your son, his gaze shifted briefly to the boy who now looked like he wanted to melt into the ground, demanded to take property that is not his, in front of witnesses, and tried to touch it without permission. That is attempted theft. Should I continue? The whispers from the crowd grew louder now. She called 911 and lied, someone said. And her son tried to steal the bike. Another added. They're in real trouble this time. Karen's voice cracked as she tried to recover. Why you can't threaten me like this? You don't control this neighborhood. The HOA does. We make the rules here, and everyone has to obey. But her words sounded weak, trembling, stripped of the confidence she had flaunted earlier. The man stepped closer, now standing just a few feet from her, his presence towering though his voice remained steady. You think the HOA rules are above the law? They are not. They are guidelines for community management. They do not override state law. They do not override federal law. And when you use them to harass, to intimidate, to steal, you step into my territory. And that, his voice dropped lower, each word cold and final, is something you should never have done. Karen stumbled back, her hands shaking, her phone slipping slightly in her grip. Her son grabbed her arm, whispering urgently, Mom, let's just stop. Let's get inside. But the man wasn't finished. He turned his gaze on the entire neighborhood now, his voice strong and clear, not angry but filled with a quiet authority that silenced every whisper. I don't care about petty arguments. I don't care about your HOA games. I came here for peace, not conflict. But understand this, if you ever cross the line again, if you ever touch what is mine, if you ever call law enforcement with lies, you won't be facing me on my porch. You'll be facing me in court, with the full weight of the state attorney's office behind me. A heavy silence fell across the street. Every neighbor stood frozen, the gravity of his words sinking deep. Karen's lips trembled, her eyes darting wildly, her voice reduced to a weak stammer. Why you wouldn't dare. But her son pulled at her sleeve, whispering harshly, Mom, stop. He's serious. He's serious. The man turned away then, his point made, his calmness more powerful than any scream or threat. He stepped back onto his porch, placed the folder neatly on his table, and rested his hand lightly on the Harley's seat. The bike gleamed in the sunlight, not just a machine anymore but a symbol of unshakable strength. Karen and her son stood frozen, humiliated in front of everyone, their authority shattered. And the neighbors? They finally saw the truth. The quiet man who never raised his voice was far more powerful than Karen and her son had ever imagined. The silence after the man's words lingered heavy in the air, like a storm cloud that refused to pass. Neighbors stayed rooted to their porches, some clutching their mugs, some folding their arms tightly, all of them watching. Karen's face was drained of color, her lips trembling, her phone dangling loosely from her hand. Her son stood half a step behind her, his cocky grin completely gone, his eyes darting nervously like a cornered animal. For the first time, the mother and son who always shouted loudest in every meeting found themselves speechless. The man returned to his porch, his movements calm, his presence unshaken. He sat in his chair as though nothing unusual had happened, resting his arm casually on the Harley's seat, his gaze sweeping once across the street. It wasn't anger in his eyes, but it wasn't kindness either. It was a calm certainty, a steady strength that made Karen's knees feel weak. She turned to her son, whispering harshly, Say something. Do something. Don't just stand there. But the boy shook his head, his arrogance shattered. Mom, he muttered, his voice low so others wouldn't hear, his serious. Didn't you see the cops? Didn't you hear what he said? He's not just some guy. He could bury us. Karen snapped back in a hiss. No one buries me. I run this neighborhood. I've controlled every family here for years. They fear me. But as she looked around, her confidence cracked even further. The neighbors' eyes no longer held fear. They held judgment, curiosity, even small sparks of satisfaction. The people she used to control with fines and threats were no longer looking at her as the leader. They were looking at her like a fool. She lied to the police. One neighbor whispered loudly enough for others to hear. That's a crime. She wanted to take his bike. Another added. That's not rules. That's theft. Karen's face burned red as the whispers spread like fire. She wanted to scream at them, to remind them who she was, but her throat felt tight. Every word she tried to form dried on her lips. Her son tugged her arm, his voice trembling. We should go inside. Mom. Everyone's watching. You look, he didn't finish, but the word hung heavy. You look weak. Karen pulled her arm back sharply, glaring at him with eyes that used to scare him but now only made him pity her. She tried to summon her usual tone of authority, but it came out brittle. This isn't over. He thinks he can intimidate us, but I'll find a way. I always do. Her son didn't answer. His eyes kept flicking toward the Harley, but the greed that had burned there earlier was gone, replaced by unease. He muttered, that's not just a bike. It's like it protects him. Karen snapped, don't talk nonsense. But even she couldn't shake the image, the way the man stood by it, the way the police had respected him, the way silence itself seemed to work like a weapon in his hands. They turned to go back inside, but the man's voice carried across the street once more, calm yet cutting like a blade. Karen, he said evenly, not loud but impossible to ignore. She froze, her hand on her door. Slowly, she turned back, her son stiff beside her. His tone was quiet, almost polite, but the weight behind it was heavier than any shouting. You called the police on a lie. You tried to take what was mine. You embarrassed yourself in front of your own neighbors. Do not test me again. Karen's face burned deeper, her pride screaming at her to fire back, but her words wouldn't come. Her son muttered something under his breath, but when the man's eyes shifted toward him, he immediately lowered his gaze. The silence stretched again, neighbors watching every second, waiting for Karen's next move. Finally, with no fight left, she opened her door and pushed her son inside. She closed it behind her with a loud slam, as if that sound could erase her humiliation. Inside the house, Karen's steps echoed through the kitchen as she paced furiously. How dare he? She hissed. How dare he humiliate me like that in front of everyone? Her son sat slouched at the table, his voice flat. He didn't humiliate you, Mom. You did that yourself. You always push too far. Her glare cut through him, but for once, he didn't back down. This time's different, he muttered. This time, you picked the wrong person. Upstairs, lights from the neighbors' windows flickered on one by one. People were making calls, retelling what they had seen, and the story spread faster than Karen could control it. By the next HOA meeting, she knew whispers would turn into open laughter, and her once firm grip on power would feel like sand slipping through her fingers. She poured herself another glass of wine with shaking hands, trying to steady her nerves, but the image of the man's calm stare haunted her. He hadn't needed to threaten, hadn't needed to shout. One look, one quiet statement, and the world had shifted. Her son stared at the table, his voice barely audible. You should let it go, Mom, before it gets worse. But Karen wasn't ready to admit defeat. Her pride, battered and bleeding, still clawed desperately for control. She whispered to herself, a vow more than a thought. No one takes my power away. No one. But deep down, beneath the wine and the anger, a seed of fear had taken root. For the first time in years, she wasn't sure she was the one holding control anymore. And outside, across the street, the man sat quietly on his porch, the Harley at his side, his calm silence speaking louder than all her screams. The following week, the neighborhood was no longer the same. The story of what had happened outside the man's cabin spread like wildfire, not just whispered from porch to porch but carried into phone calls, text messages, even beyond the gates of the community. Everyone knew what Karen had done, and everyone knew how it ended. The once feared HOA president, who used to control the streets with her fines and threats, now walked with her head low, her lips pressed tight, her eyes avoiding every neighbor she passed. Her son, once loud and cocky, now kept inside most days, his arrogant swagger replaced with nervous glances whenever he dared peek through the blinds. The man, however, remained exactly the same. Each morning, he sat on his porch with his coffee. Each evening, he parked his Harley in the same spot, its chrome catching the light of the setting sun. Neighbors who used to keep their distance now waved when they walked by. Some even crossed the street to greet him, offering small nods of respect, their voices careful but warm. "Morning," one older neighbor said quietly as he passed. "Nice bike," another added, their eyes carrying a new kind of admiration. The Harley had become more than a motorcycle. It was now a symbol. A reminder that silence could be stronger than shouting, that real authority wasn't in fines or threats but in quiet, unshakable strength. A letter soon arrived in every mailbox, stamped with the official seal of the county. It was short, direct, and powerful. The HOA had been warned by the state attorney's office about misuse of emergency services and harassment against homeowners. The letter made it clear, future abuses would not be tolerated, and individuals responsible could face legal consequences. Neighbors read the letter with wide eyes and murmured to each other. "She's finished," one said, shaking his head. "She can't bully people anymore." Finally, another whispered. Someone stood up to her and won. Karen received her copy last, standing on her porch as she tore open the envelope with shaking hands. Her son hovered behind her, his face pale. As her eyes scanned the words, her knees nearly buckled. "Warnings," she muttered, her voice cracking. "Legal warnings, from the state attorney himself." Her son's voice trembled. "It's because of him. They are protecting him." Karen's hands shook so hard the paper nearly slipped from her grip. For the first time in years, she realized the power she had clung to so tightly was gone. The neighbors she once controlled now looked at her with pity or with hidden smiles, enjoying the sight of her downfall. At the next HOA meeting, the room felt different. Karen tried to speak, but whispers drowned her out. People shifted in their seats, arms crossed, eyes hard. "Why should we listen to her?" one man asked openly. "She lied to the police." "She embarrassed this whole neighborhood," another added. Even her own board members avoided eye contact, unwilling to back her after the humiliation. For the first time, Karen's voice faltered. She stammered through the agenda, her once proud tone broken, her authority shattered. The man didn't attend the meeting. He didn't need to. His presence was already everywhere, even in silence. When Karen returned home that evening, her son tried to comfort her, but his words carried no weight. "We'll find a way back, Mom," he whispered. But Karen shook her head slowly, staring blankly out the window at the Harley across the street. "No," she said quietly, her voice hollow. "It's over. They don't fear me anymore." Across the road, the man sat quietly on his porch, his coffee in hand, his gaze steady on the horizon. He didn't smile, he didn't gloat, he didn't need to. His victory was complete, not with noise but with silence. The Harley gleamed under the fading light, a reminder of what had happened. The neighbors now saw him not as just another homeowner but as the one who had broken Karen's reign without raising his voice, without shouting, simply by standing firm and letting the truth speak louder than her lies. Karen closed her curtains that night, unable to stand the sight of him anymore. Her son retreated to his room, his dreams of owning the Harley turned to nightmares of what it had cost them. And in the quiet of the street, the man's calm strength lingered like a shadow too strong to erase. The tables had turned completely. The HOA's fear tactics were gone. Karen's false power was gone. What remained was respect, respect earned not by fear, but by truth.